I stood frozen, staring at the screen as her words pierced through me. Don't give me a wedding gift. Just get lost from my life forever. My daughter, the one I had raised, loved, and sacrificed for, had just erased me from her life. The door she slammed shut behind her left a deep void. But I wasn't about to let her walk away without consequences. I gave her a gift she'll regret forever, one that will haunt her for the rest of her life. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me the story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. Joan's phone buzzed again, a sharp, jarring sound that seemed to slice through the thick, humid air of her apartment. She was still holding the last message, her thumb hovering over the screen as if it were a weapon she wasn't quite sure how to use. The words from Tessa were etched into her mind, but this new one felt like an intrusion. A text, sent to her by mistake, or maybe not. The screen glared back at her. Just told her, no gift, no drama. Told her to get lost. Joan blinked, then stared. There was no name attached, but she recognized the tone instantly. That was Tessa's ex, Brent. And he had just sent her a message meant for someone else. Her breath caught. For a split second, she considered deleting it, pretend she'd never seen it, but that would be a lie. Instead, she saved it. As if on cue, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Tessa herself. Joan's stomach twisted. She hesitated, then opened the new message, her eyes skimming the text like a car crash she couldn't look away from. Don't give me a wedding gift. Just get lost from my life forever. Her fingers shook as she reread it. There was no mistaking it now. Tessa didn't want her in her life, not anymore. Joan's hand tightened around the phone. She didn't flinch this time. She didn't delete it. Instead, she stared at the screen until the edges of her vision began to blur. Her life, no, their lives, were crumbling faster than she could process. She tapped the screen once, opened the wire transfer app. Her thumb hovered again, this time over the confirmation for the $75,000 transfer. She had been ready to send it. A gesture of goodwill of sorts. A way to try and mend the rift. But now, the transfer didn't seem like a lifeline. It felt like an act of betrayal. She deleted the scheduled payment. The app's notification pinged back. Transfer canceled. Good. It was done. Joan sat still, the weight of her own thoughts threatening to crush her chest. Then the doorbell rang. She didn't need to look through the peephole. She knew who it was. She stood, her feet dragging on the floor as she walked toward the door. She swung it open. Lauren's eyes were soft with concern, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. You okay? Lauren asked, her voice quiet but filled with urgency. Joan didn't answer right away. She wanted to say something, anything, but her mouth felt dry. She forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. Better than she will be, Joan said, her voice steady but brittle. Lauren didn't respond immediately. She just stepped inside and closed the door behind her, her eyes scanning the room, noting the piles of papers scattered across the kitchen table. Joan's gaze flicked over to the corner of the room where a thick folder sat. Will, trust, draft. She hadn't touched it in days, but now the weight of it seemed like a cruel reminder of the choices she had yet to make. Joan walked over and opened the folder, her fingers trembling slightly. The papers were pristine, the words typed in sharp black ink, as if the future were already written there. She flicked through a few pages, her mind working faster than she could comprehend. The terms of the will were clear: assets, estate, power of attorney. And at the very end, her name was neatly typed under the heading executor. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just about money. It never had been. She was the one who had to carry it all, the consequences of their mistakes, their betrayals, the broken relationships. Her breath hitched as she glanced at Lauren, who was standing behind her now, her face unreadable. What does this all mean? Joan whispered, half to herself, half to Lauren. Before Lauren could answer, there was another sound, one that Joan barely registered at first. A small beep from her phone, followed by the abrupt silence of the room. The message was from Tessa again, but this time, Joan didn't open it. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done. Her fingers hovered over the phone again. And for the first time, she didn't care who saw it. She hit send. Tessa, you'll regret this, and I'll be here to make sure you never forget it." Joan stared at the screen, her heart hammering in her chest, waiting for the reply she knew was coming. Joan stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the mess she had created. It wasn't physical chaos. There were no broken dishes or scattered objects, but something felt off, like her life had been emptied out into disarray, and she wasn't sure how to start picking it up. The phone rang, slicing through the tension. Joan barely flinched before she answered. "Naomi," she said, her voice carrying an edge she hadn't expected. "We're redoing everything." Naomi's voice was a steady anchor in the storm. "Understood. I'll be there in an hour." Joan hung up, the brief call echoing in her ears. She walked toward the window, the view of the city below feeling distant, almost foreign. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. An hour later, Naomi arrived, tall, with sleek, purposeful movements. Naomi had always been the professional Joan could rely on in moments like these. Her expression was unreadable as she stepped inside, scanning the room before turning to Joan. "Let's get to it," Naomi said, setting her briefcase down. Joan nodded but didn't speak. She knew exactly what needed to be done. Every move she made now felt like a final step away from the person she once was. A person who had tried, for far too long, to make things right. It was time to sever the last threads that tied her to Tessa. Naomi pulled out the legal paperwork, spreading it across the table. Joan's fingers brushed over the document titled Will and Trust, a cold reminder of everything she had just lost. With a steady hand, Naomi began drafting changes. First, Joan signed the removal of Tessa from the will, from the trust, and from every account beneficiary. It felt like the final breath in a long, painful exhale. "I'm removing her from everything," Joan said, the words sharp, each one heavier than the last. Naomi paused, then nodded. "Understood. And what about the $75,000? Joan's breath caught. It had been meant for Tessa, a gift, a gesture, a final chance at redemption. But that was gone now, along with any hope of reconciliation. She flipped through the papers, signing one change after another. The transfer was no longer for Tessa. Instead, Joan redirected the funds into an education account for Caitlin. The thought of Caitlin, so young and full of promise, brought some peace to Joan's turbulent mind. She could give her something Tessa would never appreciate, a future. Joan's fingers trembled as she typed in the new pins on her phone. Each new password was another lock, another barrier to the life she'd been clinging to for far too long. The app chimed with confirmation as the last of her financial ties to Tessa dissolved. Naomi was on the phone now, coordinating the freeze on Joan's accounts. The new powers of attorney, setting up alerts. The weight of it all pressed down on Joan's chest, but she didn't flinch. This was the world she had created, and now it was time to face it. "Is everything secure?" Joan asked, though she already knew the answer. "Everything's locked down," Naomi replied, "but we'll need a statement of intent." Joan felt the familiar pressure of tears building, but she held them back. She couldn't afford to be vulnerable, not now. "Write it up, outline the emotional abandonment. I won't keep pretending." Naomi's pen scratched across the paper. Joan's eyes flitted over the legal jargon. But she wasn't really reading. The words blurred, her mind swimming. She could feel the emotional distance between her and Tessa growing, an abyss too wide to cross. Finally, Naomi slid a fresh document across the table, one Joan had signed countless times in the past. "Your legacy," Naomi said, her voice almost soft. "What you leave behind." Joan stared at the document, but it wasn't the words that caught her attention. It was the title on the new savings account form, typed neatly at the top of the page. "Legacy I'm proud of." Joan signed it without hesitation. She wasn't sure what it meant, whether it was an act of defiance, of closure, or something else entirely, but it felt like the right thing to do. "All done?" Joan asked, her voice surprisingly calm. Naomi gathered the documents, packing them neatly into her briefcase. She didn't speak at first, but her eyes lingered on Joan for a moment too long. "I think so," Naomi said. Then, with a pause, "But there's one more thing." Joan's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what to expect anymore. "What?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Naomi's gaze softened, and she looked almost hesitant. "You should probably check your phone." Joan's blood ran cold as she reached for it. The screen lit up with a new message. The name glaring back at her. Tessa. It was too soon. She wasn't ready. But Joan tapped the message, her hands unsteady as she read the words. "You're making a mistake, and you'll regret this." Her pulse quickened. She had known it was coming, but still, this felt different. Joan closed her eyes, the weight of her decisions settling into her bones. The storm wasn't over, not by a long shot. The envelope was simple, the typewritten address bold against the white paper. Joan didn't hesitate. She slid the card out, reading the words she'd already written in her head 1,000 times. "Per your request, I will not attend. No embellishments. No apologies." She'd already been cast out, and this was the final punctuation to the sentence. She placed the card in a crisp white envelope and set it on the counter. Her fingers lingered over the seal. There was no satisfaction in it. Only the dull weight of finality, a decision made, a door shut. The doorbell rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. Lauren stood in the doorway, a small pie nestled in her arms and a bottle of champagne hanging from one hand, the weight of it seeming more symbolic than anything. "To reclaiming dignity," Lauren said, her voice laced with quiet resolve as she stepped inside. Placing the items on the kitchen table, the pie was warm, its crust golden and flaky, but Joan hardly noticed. Lauren took a seat, watching Joan carefully as she popped the cork, the champagne fizzing in the silence. She poured 2 glasses, and the bubbles seemed louder than they should have been. Joan accepted the glass wordlessly, her fingers tracing the rim. It wasn't the alcohol she needed. It was something far more elusive, peace. Lauren lifted her glass. "To you," she said simply, her gaze steady and unwavering. Joan clinked her glass against Lauren's, but the gesture felt hollow. She swallowed the champagne in one quick gulp. The effervescence a fleeting distraction. Then, with a sigh, Joan moved to the living room, her gaze falling on the screen. The wedding rehearsal was live streaming, an awkward echo of what had once been a shared dream between her and Tessa. The feed was muted, but she could still see the movement of people, flashes of the wedding party, the pale color of the flowers, the dress. The faint hum of distant voices filtered through the speakers. She squinted at the screen, her attention caught by a figure that stood out in the crowd, Brent. "Bride's side is light today," Brent's voice rang out, a poorly timed joke that hung in the air. His words didn't seem to land with any of the people standing nearby. Joan's eyes never left the screen, even as she saw Brent's smile. A smile that was now an unbearable reminder of everything Tessa had been, and everything Joan could never have. Tessa was there too, though she didn't look at the camera. Joan's eyes searched her face for a moment, trying to decipher the silence that seemed to hang between them, a silence that hadn't existed before. Tessa stood stiff, her arms crossed, her face set in a mask of indifference. She didn't acknowledge the live feed, didn't make any effort to show a shred of warmth or recognition. She simply existed. And that, in the end, was enough. Joan's heart sank, her grip tightening on her champagne flute. She wanted to look away, to turn off the feed, but she couldn't. She needed to see it, to witness the distance between them in real time. The sound of typing from behind her made Joan glance over her shoulder. Naomi was sitting at the dining table, her laptop open. The click of her fingers the only sound in the otherwise tense room. Joan had asked her to update her funeral directives earlier. No mention of Tessa. She had been clear about it. No notification. Naomi's fingers paused over the keyboard, then continued. Joan's eyes shifted back to the screen. She felt the heat of the champagne in her chest, a warmth that couldn't quite reach her heart. It was strange to see Tessa like this, so close, and yet so far away. Tessa had been her everything once, and now she was a shadow, just a face on a screen. Joan closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling deeply as the weight of the moment settled in. The woman she had once known, the woman she had once loved, was gone. The wedding was a reminder of that, of a future she would never share, of a past that had turned to ash. Naomi closed her laptop with a soft click, her eyes meeting Joan's. There was nothing more to be said, nothing more to be done. Joan had made her decisions, and now There was only one thing left to do. Joan turned back to the screen one last time, her pulse quickening as she watched the feed continue. The faces blurred into the background, the muted chatter from the speakers falling silent as a new message popped up on her phone. It was from Tessa. "You'll regret this." Joan's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest as she read the words. She set the phone down slowly, her hands shaking. She had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier. Joan stared at the email from the florist, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. The floral arrangement had been ordered weeks ago, an elegant display of white lilies and roses, a symbol of peace, a gesture of finality. She had intended to send them to Tessa's wedding, a quiet offering to mark the end of everything. But now, it felt like a mistake. The weight of the flowers, their beauty, their symbolism seemed to mock her. She clicked the email open, her gaze flicking over the florist's bill. It was detailed, precise, $3,800. The flowers had already been delivered, but she could still cancel her contribution to the bill. She had to. It was the only thing left to do. Her hand trembled as she hit the reply button. "I'd like to cancel my contribution," she typed, the words coming out colder than she expected. A few seconds later, the florist's response pinged back. "We require confirmation from the person who made the order. Kindly respond with an acknowledgement." Joan took a breath. She hadn't thought it through, hadn't anticipated this. Her thumb hovered over her phone. Then she scrolled back through her messages until she found it, the one text she had been dreading. Tessa's words, a virtual slap across her face. "Don't give me a wedding gift. Just get lost from my life forever." Joan hit screenshot, the image crystallizing in her mind as she attached it to the email. Without a second thought, she sent it off. No words were needed. The phone buzzed with a response from Naomi a few moments later. "Done." Joan put her phone down and walked to the kitchen. The house felt different now, quieter, even though Lauren was sitting at the table. Lauren, who had been by her side through everything, sat watching Joan with a careful, measured gaze, as though trying to decide what the next word should be. Joan opened the cabinet and pulled out a bottle of wine, her fingers curling around the neck as she twisted the corkscrew. She poured 2 glasses, one for her and one for Lauren, and then took a slow sip. The taste was sharp, almost biting. It felt like it could clear out the fog in her chest, but it didn't. Nothing could do that now. "Brent's family just posted some pre-wedding photos," Lauren said after a long pause, setting her own glass down on the table. "Everyone's smiling," Joan's stomach turned. She didn't need to see those photos, didn't need to follow that happy little parade of false promises. Without a word, she grabbed her phone again and opened Instagram. There it was, Tessa's family looking perfect and poised in front of a glowing wedding arch, smiling like everything was just the way it should be. Joan clicked unfollow. "I did that a few minutes ago," Lauren said, with a small, understanding smile. It's like they never existed. Joan exhaled, the weight in her chest not quite lifting, but the pressure easing. "I needed to do that," she muttered. "I don't want to keep seeing their faces." "Understandable," Lauren replied softly, though her voice carried a touch of sympathy Joan wasn't ready for. "How does it feel?" Joan hesitated, the glass in her hand suddenly feeling too heavy. "Strangely like clarity," she said after a beat, her voice distant but sure. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was something. A sense of certainty. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. She had chosen her path. A knock on the door startled them both. Joan frowned, setting her glass down before she went to answer. When she opened the door, she found Caitlin standing there, a small but brightly colored envelope clutched in her hands. "I made this for you," Caitlin said, her voice shy but earnest. Joan knelt down, taking the envelope from her hands and pulling out a drawing. It was a simple, sweet card, scribbled with crayons and colored pencils. The words were clear, even if the handwriting was a little shaky. "Thank you for being my best grown-up." Joan's chest tightened as she read it, her heart breaking in a way she hadn't expected. She felt a lump form in her throat, and for a moment, the weight of everything, the pain, the loss, the decisions, felt like it was about to overflow. She swallowed it down. forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Caitlin," Joan said softly, her voice thick. "I'll treasure this always." Caitlin smiled up at her, wide-eyed and hopeful, before turning and skipping away toward the yard. Joan watched her go, feeling a sting of gratitude she wasn't sure how to process. This at least was pure. There was no history here, no strings attached. Just love. Simple, unconditional love. Joan closed the door quietly and leaned against it for a moment. Her phone buzzed again, and she picked it up without thinking. It was a message from Naomi. "Everything's been updated. You're secure." Joan didn't respond. Instead, she set the phone down, her hand resting on the edge of the table. The last of her old life was falling away, one piece at a time. The flowers, the wedding, the people, everything that had once been part of the woman she thought she was now behind her. The path ahead was clear, but it was still uncharted. And that, somehow, felt like freedom. Joan's phone rang just as she finished putting the final piece of the puzzle in place. The title transfer for the condo was done. Another decision, another small act of severance. She'd turned it over to the trust. The plans for a future she would never share with Tessa, now etched in black ink. The condo, once a symbol of their shared dreams, would be donated to a housing nonprofit once the time was right. It felt like the only thing left to do. Let something good come out of the wreckage. The phone continued to buzz, the number flashing across the screen. Tessa. Joan stared at it for a moment, the familiar pang of something unspoken hitting her chest. But she didn't answer. She couldn't. She wasn't sure she ever would. Instead, she hit save. The voicemail icon appeared in the corner of the screen. Joan hesitated before clicking it open. Tessa's voice, the same voice that had once been her anchor, was shaky, almost raw. "Joan, it's me. I'm sorry. Things got messy. I was stressed. Can we talk?" Joan's thumb hovered over the screen as the words repeated in her mind, but there was no hesitation this time. She wasn't going to take the bait. She hit reply and typed the words slowly, deliberately. "Please respect my absence, per your request." It felt almost robotic, but it was the truth. She had to set boundaries. She had to. There was no going back, no more conversations that went in circles. Not after everything. She hit send, then put the phone down as though it were a hot coal. Too dangerous to hold on to any longer. The weight of the message, the finality of it, settled in her chest. She stared at the phone, waiting for a reply that didn't come. Across the room, Naomi was reviewing the documents on the laptop, her fingers moving steadily over the keys. Joan could hear the rhythmic tap of the keyboard as Naomi worked, her presence steadying, like a grounding force in the whirlwind that had become Joan's life. Naomi paused and looked over at Joan. "The statement of intent has been updated. I've included the message transcript." Joan nodded, though it felt strange to look at the words on paper now. A part of her wanted to say something, anything, but the silence between them felt full. The air in the room was thick with the weight of all the decisions made, and Joan wasn't sure what there was left to say. Instead, she moved toward the desk, a feeling of completion washing over her as she finalized the transfer of the condo title into the trust. It was done now. No more lingering ties to the past. Lauren walked in just then, her presence breaking the silence like a breath of fresh air. She had been quiet for a while, respecting Joan's need for space, but now she took a seat beside her at the desk, watching Joan's movements with an unreadable look. "You're building a future from the ashes," Lauren said, her voice soft but firm, like she was offering Joan something more than just words. Joan didn't look up, but she felt the truth in it. It was no longer about what had been or what could have been. The past had already burned away, and all she had left now were the scattered pieces to rebuild with. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't perfect, but it was hers. As the minutes passed, the phone remained silent, the absence of Tessa's name on the screen almost deafening. Joan leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes, feeling the weight of the day settling in. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. She had finally, irreversibly stepped into her own future. And whatever came next, she was ready. Joan sat at the kitchen table, her fingers poised over her phone. The screen glowed in the quiet room, the weight of the message she was about to send heavier than anything she'd written in days. Tessa's voice had lingered, even after the voicemail was long gone. "I'm sorry, things got messy." Joan felt the thin thread of Tessa's apology slip through her fingers like sand. She hit reply and typed the words slowly. "Fix what? The wedding or the way you spoke of me?" There, that was all. No embellishments, no plea for clarity, no attempt at bridging the gap between them. The distance had already been carved too deep. She hit send and sat back, feeling strangely light as the weight of her decision settled into place. Across the room, Naomi was once again buried in paperwork. Joan could hear the rustle of pages turning, the quiet click of the mouse. Naomi had been a rock in the chaos of the past few weeks, her calm presence grounding Joan when the world felt too shaky. "The trust is secure now," Naomi said, glancing up from her screen. "We've added the early distribution prevention clauses. No one can touch it until it's time." Joan nodded, the briefest flicker of relief washing over her. She hadn't wanted Tessa to have access to anything. No more entanglements, no more open doors. It had been one of the hardest parts, severing those financial ties. But now, everything was locked down. There were no more surprises lurking just out of sight. Just as Joan exhaled, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Brent. "We were being funny," he texted. "You know Tessa, she's stressed. It wasn't meant to be personal." Joan's thumb hovered over the screen. He couldn't possibly be serious. A laugh, a joke, a passing comment. It had all felt like another jab, another attempt to trivialize everything that had happened. She typed, then paused, her mind racing, her emotions simmering beneath the surface. "I do, and I've adjusted accordingly." It was enough. He would understand it for what it was, or he wouldn't. Either way, she had said what needed to be said. No more. She put the phone down on the table and pushed back from the chair. The walls of the apartment felt like they were closing in on her, the stillness pressing against her chest. A knock on the door broke the silence, pulling Joan back to the present. She stood and opened it, finding Caitlin standing in front of her with a wide, innocent smile. "Hi, Joan. Want to paint pottery with me?" Joan couldn't help but smile, the child's offer a brief reprieve from the weight of everything else. "I'd love to," she said. Kneeling down to Caitlin's level, the two of them spent the afternoon at the kitchen table, their hands covered in paint as they carefully brushed colors onto ceramic plates and mugs. Caitlin's enthusiasm was contagious, her small hands trembling with excitement as she chose colors and patterns. The sound of brushes against pottery was oddly soothing, and for the first time in days, Joan felt a sense of peace. Caitlin looked up at her, her eyes wide with curiosity. "When will my mommy be done with her wedding?" Joan's heart stuttered for a moment, the sharp reminder of Tessa's absence stinging more than she expected. But she smiled, ruffling Caitlin's hair. "Soon," she said, her voice steady. "And then we'll all be happy, okay?" Caitlin nodded solemnly, not entirely understanding, but trusting Joan's words anyway. The afternoon passed in quiet conversation and laughter, the air thick with the weight of unspoken things. By the time they finished painting, the room felt lighter, as if a small piece of the tension had finally been allowed to dissipate. Later that evening, Joan found herself standing in the hallway, a box of baby clothes tucked under her arm. These were her mother's, clothes that had been passed down from one generation to the next. They were meant for Caitlin, for the family that had been so much a part of Joan's life. But now they didn't belong to her anymore. She walked out to the car, the box heavy in her hands, and drove to Caitlin's house. The street was quiet, the night sky clear and still. She left the box on the doorstep. A small note tucked inside. For Caitlin, love, Joan. Joan stood for a moment, just looking at the house, the quietness of it all. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for, what she was waiting for, but as she turned and walked back to the car, she realized something. This was the moment, the first real clear step forward. She didn't need to look back anymore. Joan's phone buzzed, pulling her from the quiet of the night. She glanced at the screen. Tessa's face stared back at her, shiny, bright, and animated. Joan's breath caught in her throat, a familiar knot of anger and disbelief already tightening in her chest. A new TikTok video. Tessa stood in front of a lush backdrop, likely some trendy cafe or another well-polished corner of her carefully curated life. Her smile was wide, fake almost, but expertly crafted. She held up her phone and began speaking with that tone, the one that Joan had come to dread over the years, the one that sounded like she was in on some kind of secret joke, while everyone else was too naive to understand it. Tired of narcissistic parents who demand praise for, just being parents, Tessa said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. Like, oh, I gave you life. You owe me everything. She made exaggerated gestures, her hands sweeping through the air as she laughed at the absurdity of it all. Like, sorry, I'm not your personal fan club. You can't just expect a trophy for not being a total disaster. Gotta do more than that, right? Joan felt her jaw tighten, her fingers tightening around the phone. She didn't need to finish watching. She'd seen enough. Her mind was already racing, the bitter taste of betrayal filling her mouth. Without thinking, Joan pulled up the screen recording function and started filming. She was too far gone to stop herself now. The urge to collect this moment, to turn it into something more concrete. Stronger than any remnant of her desire to hold on to the scraps of the past. She finished the recording and sent it straight to Naomi, her pulse quickening. Naomi, she typed with a single breath. Check this out. I'm saving it as proof. The public defamation continues. She hit send, then immediately added it to the estate file. This too would be part of the story. Another nail in the coffin. Another confirmation that Tessa was out of line. Joan paused for a moment, looking at the file, now growing thick with evidence of her former life. There was no going back. The phone buzzed again, and Joan glanced at it. Naomi's response was immediate. Let them perform, Naomi wrote. You've already closed the stage curtain. Joan smiled, though the gesture was tight, filled with sharp edges. Naomi always knew what to say. Naomi had been her one constant, the calm in the storm, and she was right. Tessa's performance was for an audience Joan had no part in anymore. She had nothing left to prove to people like that. The weight in her chest lightened, just slightly. Lauren, of course, couldn't resist the spectacle. This is better than cable, she texted. Joan rolled her eyes, her lips curving into a bitter laugh. Lauren's sense of humor had always been more sardonic than Joan had ever fully appreciated. But tonight, the bite of it landed just right. Joan put the phone down on the kitchen table, the cool surface grounding her for a moment as she exhaled slowly. It wasn't enough just to collect the moments. She needed to make sure they stayed buried, far from her reach. She walked over to her desk, where the draft of her obituary lay waiting. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she added the final touch, the one that felt like the sharpest exhale of all. She deleted the line that had been there for so long, beloved family member. Instead, she typed, survived by her closest friends, who knew her for the strength she showed even when the world betrayed her. She read it over, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the final separation. No more pretending. No more lies about who she was or who she was meant to be in their eyes. Joan leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on the screen as the weight of it all settled over her. She wasn't holding on to a family anymore. She wasn't holding on to anything that wasn't real, but there was still one last thing to do. Her thumb hovered over the send button, her gaze steady, and then her phone buzzed once again. A new message, a new notification. Joan didn't need to check it. She already knew. Tessa, again. Her fingers moved before she could stop them. One last look. One last reminder that no matter how far she went, no matter how much she cut away, Tessa's voice would always linger. I'm not your fan club, Joan. The letter arrived on a quiet, unassuming afternoon. Joan had been sitting at the kitchen table, an old novel open before her. The world moving around her like it always did, calm but far too heavy to hold on to. Tessa's handwriting on the envelope caught her eye. She hesitated before opening it, fingers trembling just a little. Something about the neat, looping script felt like an intrusion, like the past clawing its way back in. She tore open the envelope slowly, her mind already bracing for whatever emotional nonsense Tessa was about to dump onto her. The letter was long, too long for anything to be clear, and Joan skimmed through the emotional knots, the vague apologies woven in with excuses, justifications wrapped in the thinnest veil of sorrow. She read about regret, how Tessa had come to realize the damage she had done, how she'd let time and misunderstanding fester until it was too late. There were the usual lines about missing the connection they had, the love she'd always had for Joan, and the vague suggestion that maybe, just maybe, things could have been different if only. Joan didn't know how long she sat there, the letter in her hands. She didn't even bother to finish it, letting her eyes wander over the words, absorbing nothing. It was a strange sensation, like being force-fed something that had long since lost its taste. She set the letter down on the table, face blank, her heart not even stirring at the words Tessa had put to paper. She wasn't surprised by the timing. The damage had been done, and no amount of late apologies could fix the cracks. She'd built something sturdy since then, and Tessa's words felt like water in the cracks of a dam that had already broken. Joan turned to her phone, tapping out a quick message to Naomi. Another letter, another apology. She didn't expect a reply, but Naomi's response came within minutes. Add it to the file. Timestamp the apology. It's part of the record, not the healing. Joan gave a brief, humorless laugh. Naomi's practicality had always been her anchor. No one else seemed to understand the need for hard facts in a world built on ephemeral emotions. Joan snapped a photo of the letter and attached it to the ever-growing digital file. Another page, another piece of evidence. There was nothing else to do with it. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Later that evening, Joan's phone rang unexpectedly. It was Caitlin's mom, her voice warm but a little overwhelmed. "Joan," she said, "I just wanted to thank you again. The box you left for Caitlin, it's more than just clothes. You don't understand, but it changed everything." Joan's grip on the phone tightened. She could hear the rawness in the other woman's voice, the emotion she was trying to keep steady. Joan was surprised by the small twinge in her chest. Something close to relief, something close to pride. "That's what legacy is," Joan said, quietly, the words coming to her almost without thinking. The phrase felt right, like it had always been hers. Even when she hadn't realized it, there was a brief pause on the other end. I wanted you to know that, Joan. What you did, it meant the world." Joan felt a tightness in her throat, and it wasn't sadness. It was something more complicated, something unfamiliar. She hung up shortly after, her thoughts swirling, her legacy. It wasn't what she had expected. It wasn't what she had been trained to hope for. But it was real. Caitlin, at least, had been given something more than the mess Tessa had left behind. Later that week, Joan found herself at a small community center, sitting in the back of a classroom full of eager faces. She had volunteered to teach a basic tech literacy class for seniors, something she hadn't considered before but felt drawn to after hearing about the program from a friend. The class was small, the room filled with the scent of coffee and the soft murmur of conversation as she introduced herself. At first, she had thought she was here to give, to help people navigate the world of smartphones and email. But as she spoke to them, Joan realized that the true gift was being given to her. Each time she answered a question, each time she explained something as simple as how to send an email or browse a website, she could feel the walls inside her start to crumble. She was no longer the person who had been consumed by Tessa's drama. Nor was she someone trying to fix what had broken so long ago. She was just here. A woman in the front row raised her hand, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "You make it sound so easy," she said. Joan returned the smile, her chest lighter than it had been in months. "It's easier when you're not doing it alone," she replied. The room hummed with a quiet warmth as Joan continued, each lesson feeling more like a step away from the past, more like the person she had started to become, the person she was meant to be. When the class ended, one of the participants stopped by her desk, a small, handwritten note in hand. "Thank you for giving me a chance," the note read. "I never thought I'd get this far." Joan folded it carefully and tucked it into her bag. She didn't need to look back, not now, but as she walked out into the cool evening air, something inside her shifted. She didn't need Tessa's apology. She didn't need any of it. The future was already being written, and this time it was hers. Then her phone buzzed again. A new message from Tessa. Joan sat across from Naomi at the kitchen table, the air between them heavy with a quiet finality. The papers before them were crisp, meticulously organized, each page a step further into the future Joan was shaping, one where Tessa had no place. Naomi had been her anchor throughout all of this, her voice of reason, her constant in the madness of the past few months. Naomi tapped her pen lightly against the stack of documents. "Final draft. The trust is locked," she said, her voice low but steady. "It's all ready." Joan didn't reply at first, her fingers tracing the edge of a mug, lost in thought. She had spent too many years, decades, really, living within the tangled mess of expectations, guilt, and empty promises. Now, with the papers in front of her, she was taking ownership of what was hers, all of it. Every penny, every possession, every shred of control that had been stolen from her over the years. Naomi slid a final page over to Joan. "I've added the last clause," she said, her eyes meeting Joan's. "It's clear. It'll stand." Joan's gaze flickered down to the words printed neatly at the bottom of the page. She read them twice, the cold finality of them settling into her bones. "Any person who estrange themselves shall not benefit." Her thumb brushed the edge of the paper, a chill running through her. It was done. The final word on Tessa. There would be no inheritance, no final act of kindness. Tessa had severed every tie between them, and now she would pay for it. Joan glanced up, locking eyes with Naomi. "It's done then, all of it." Naomi nodded, a faint smile crossing her face. "Everything is protected. The estate is secured." She paused, her fingers resting lightly on the final stack of papers. "Everything is where it should be." Joan took a deep breath, the weight of it all settling in her chest. The property, the annuities, the savings, everything was now part of the trust, carefully retitled and sealed under her name. There was no going back. This wasn't just about money, it was about control, about rewriting the rules of a future that had once seemed so uncertain. And then came the decision she had been avoiding, the one that had felt too raw, too tender to consider until now. Joan flipped to the next page of the trust's documentation, and with a quiet resolve, she wrote the name she hadn't thought to include before, Caitlin. Her granddaughter, the bright spot in a world so often darkened by betrayal, would be taken care of. Joan designated a scholarship seed for Caitlin, a growth-based release to be unlocked when the time was right. Not just for college, but for a future where Caitlin would have the tools to carve her own path, free from the cycles that had trapped Joan in the past. The trust would grow, its value increasing over time, just like Caitlin. Joan felt a flicker of something warm, a sense of purpose filling the empty spaces. Naomi's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her tone a quiet question in the air. "It's permanent." Joan paused for a moment, staring at the words in front of her. "Yes, it's time to stop pretending." Naomi gave a single nod. The conversation over, there was no need for more. With a soft exhale, Joan moved the completed trust to one side of the table. "Send out the summary," she said. "Tessa will get her copy, but there's nothing for her here." Naomi hesitated just a moment, but then she picked up the phone, quickly typing out a brief message. "Courtesy copy sent," she said, a slight edge in her voice. "No standing." "And that's all." Joan watched as Naomi sent the notification. The paperwork had been filed, the decisions made. There would be no surprise inheritance, no last-minute changes. It was finished. The following day, Joan found herself staring at her phone. A new email popped up in her inbox, this one from Brent. Her heart sank slightly as she opened it. "You're cutting off your own daughter." Joan stared at the words for a long moment, the question hanging in the air like an accusation. Her thumb hovered over the phone, her pulse quickening. The audacity of it. Brent had always been the one to side with Tessa. Always. It wasn't surprising that he would feel entitled to an explanation, as if she owed him some justification. But she didn't. She didn't owe anyone an explanation anymore. Her fingers shook as she typed the response. "I'm not cutting off anyone. I'm protecting what's mine, what's real. I'm done." She stared at the message, fingers hovering over the send button. There was something final in her words. The finality was both suffocating and freeing. She hit send. A quiet beep signaled its departure, and Joan felt something shift inside her. The future was hers now. No one was going to take it from her. Not Tessa, not Brent. And certainly not the ghost of a family that never really existed. Joan stood up, looking out the window, the cool light of the early evening spilling across the room. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. And for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. Joan's fingers brushed over the holiday card, the glossy surface of it too bright under the dim kitchen light. The card was tucked between the pile of bills and a grocery store flyer, a faint reminder that life, in all its messy chaos, continued moving forward. Tessa's name was scrawled on the front in the same familiar script, a touch of coldness hanging in the air as Joan slowly opened it. Inside, Tessa's message was just as Joan had expected. 2 sentences that dripped with passive-aggressive sweetness. Wishing you warmth and joy in the coming year. I hope we can find our way back to each other soon. With love, Tessa. The words were all too familiar in their hollow sincerity. Tessa's love was nothing more than a performative gesture, a way to keep the door cracked, in case she ever needed it again. Joan could almost hear the thinly veiled message between the lines. I'm still here, aren't I? But Joan wasn't biting anymore. She dropped the card back on the table, her heart beating steady in her chest. She had been playing this game for far too long. Tessa's attempts to reinsert herself were futile now. Joan wasn't interested in reopening the wounds. Her response, or lack thereof, would be the silence that filled the void where Tessa's words used to matter. Instead of responding, Joan focused on the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through the window. She had something better to do today. The house was filled with the sound of laughter and chatter, a familiar comfort. The table, sprawling across her dining room, was set for a Friendsgiving, a gathering she'd hosted for the past few years. But this time it felt different. The faces were new, a reflection of the path she had chosen. There was Caitlin's family, of course, her daughter, Rachel, and her husband, Mike, but also a few neighbors, some she'd only known for a few months. They were all gathered here, sitting at her table, breaking bread and talking about life, not the complicated messes of the past. Lauren raised her glass, a soft clink of crystal ringing through the room. Joan looked around the table, feeling a sense of peace, of something growing stronger in the space between them. To choosing who deserves our time, Lauren toasted, her voice full of sincerity, the warmth in her eyes matching the sentiment in her words. Joan smiled, a soft exhale escaping her lips. It wasn't just about choosing the people she wanted to be around. It was about protecting herself, creating a space where she could thrive. She looked at Caitlin, who was laughing at something Rachel had said, her wide eyes sparkling with joy. The future, Joan realized, was already here. It was built in moments like these, where she had made the choice to surround herself with those who mattered, those who had earned her time. Later, after dinner, Joan sat down at the small desk in the corner of the room, the glow of a lamp casting soft shadows across the antique jewelry she'd been meaning to part with for months. The pieces had been passed down to her from her mother, delicate brooches, necklaces, and rings, all reminders of a past she no longer wished to carry. She had decided what they would become: a donation to a women's shelter, a gift for those who would cherish them as much as she once had, but who needed them far more now. She carefully filled out the donation paperwork, the weight of her decision settling in with each line she wrote. It was another step forward, a final letting go of the things she had once believed were valuable, but now felt like anchors to a time that no longer defined her. Joan put the pen down, a sense of completion washing over her. The jewelry, like the old family ties, was now part of something bigger, something more meaningful. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from the moment. She glanced at the screen and saw the notification from Brent. Her stomach tightened as she opened the message, her eyes scanning the PayPal request for an amount that made her skin crawl, a honeymoon upgrade. She could almost hear the entitlement in his words. Hey, Joan, would love if you could help out with this upgrade. Tessa and I would really appreciate it. Thanks. Joan's jaw tightened, her finger hovering over the screen. The nerve. She hadn't spoken to Brent directly in weeks, and here he was, asking for more, like the boundaries she'd put up didn't matter. She typed a response quickly, her fingers steady as she typed the words that came so easily now. I'm not giving you money for your honeymoon. I've already given enough. Without hesitation, she hit send. The message disappeared into the ether, leaving only the faintest sense of finality behind. Joan placed her phone face down on the table, and for a moment, the weight of it all settled into her chest. She had made her choice. She was done explaining herself. She was done with the people who thought they had a claim on her life. The last act of the day was almost automatic. She picked up the wedding invitation from the corner of the table, its bright envelope still untouched. The gold-embossed letters spelling out Tessa and Brent's names in pristine script. Joan stared at it for a moment, the simplicity of the gesture almost too much to bear. Then she grabbed a pen and wrote across the front of it, "No thanks." She slid it back into the envelope, sealed it, and with a steady hand, placed it in the mail slot. No RSVP, no explanation, no attempt to heal old wounds. Tessa had asked for a future, but Joan had already built hers, and it didn't include her. As the evening came to a close, Joan stood at the window, looking out at the stars. The cool night air whispered through the cracks of the house, and for the first time in a long while, Joan felt the quiet certainty of her decisions settle into her bones. The past was behind her, and the future was hers to shape. The phone didn't stop ringing. Joan sat in the quiet of her living room, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. As Naomi's voice filtered through the speakerphone, terse but unwavering. "I've been going through the voicemails," Naomi said, her words clipped with professional detachment. "It's the same pattern: gaslighting, crying, bargaining. She's trying to wear you down." Joan's eyes moved to the pile of papers on the coffee table, old receipts, outdated newsletters, and the last shred of Tessa's letter. It all felt like an eternity ago. But now, Tessa's voice, raw and pleading, was carving its way back into her life like a splinter that wouldn't let go. Naomi continued, the faint click of her keyboard audible in the background. "I've transcribed them, all of them. They're archived now, in case we need them." Joan nodded absently, the words in Naomi's calm, methodical voice cutting through the fog of her own thoughts. The transcripts were all too familiar. Tessa's usual manipulative rhetoric, her voice changing like an actor slipping between roles. 1 minute a sobbing plea, the next a cold, calculated demand. Joan had no tolerance for it anymore. She glanced at the phone again, her thumb pressing down on the screen. The texts, the calls, the relentless messages. Each one felt like an intrusion. There was no stopping it. Tessa didn't understand boundaries. She never had. "I'll send the cease and desist," Naomi said. Her tone was steady, no emotion in it. It was business, nothing more. "This has gone too far. She can't keep doing this." Joan felt a strange mix of relief and bitterness as she leaned back in the chair. It was done. The line had been crossed. Her patience, stretched so thin for years, had finally snapped. Tessa had pushed too hard, and now she would feel the consequences. The next day, Joan updated her emergency access settings. Everything locked down, sealed tighter than before. No more gaps, no more room for anyone to sneak in. The numbers she'd once kept on speed dial were now blocked, erased from her life in an instant. When the last number was blocked, Joan sat back in the chair, her chest feeling lighter, emptier. It was done. There was no going back. A text came through almost immediately. A response from Lauren. "You're finally untouchable." Joan stared at the words, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Lauren had always been the blunt one, the realist. But now, her words felt like an affirmation of the finality she'd just put in place. Joan was untouchable, and somehow, that didn't feel as freeing as she thought it would. It felt like the silence that follows a storm, calm but heavy with the weight of everything that had been lost. As she turned to leave the room, Joan's eyes fell on the small stack of postcards on the hallway table. One stood out, a simple, unassuming envelope. She picked it up, already knowing what it was. The handwriting was familiar. Caitlin's. Joan took a breath, her heart tight. She set the postcard aside for a moment before walking into her study, where the quiet of the room settled around her. This was what mattered. This was where she needed to focus. Joan sat down at her desk, the weight of the letter in her hands. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer and began to write, her hand steady. Caitlin, I know you might wonder why I made the decisions I did. I want you to know that I did it for you, for your future. I chose to let go of things and people that didn't deserve my time, my energy, or my love. This is why I chose you. The words came easy, a promise for the future. Joan carefully folded the letter and placed it in the envelope, her fingers lingering over the seal before she stood. The room feeling strangely full with the weight of what she'd just said. She looked at the envelope, the simple, powerful truth of it in her hands. There were no more regrets left to make. The future was already written. Joan stared at the photo, her fingers trembling as she held it between them. It was an old one of the last snapshots before everything had fallen apart. Tessa smiling in the front, Caitlin nestled in her lap, and Joan caught mid-laugh, a moment of warmth before the coldness had crept in. A family snapshot, a lie in its simplest form. The weight of it pressed down on Joan's chest, but the sadness wasn't what she expected. No, it was something else, something she could only describe as guilt. Tessa's face in the photo, frozen in time, seemed to plead with her. The unspoken accusation was always there, hovering just beneath the surface. You could have tried harder. You could have fixed this. Joan felt the pull, the guilt they tried to sell her, the burden they had left on her shoulders for too many years. The idea that family was sacred, that forgiveness was mandatory, that she was the one who needed to make it work. It had never been her burden to carry, but they had made it feel like it was. Her thumb hovered over the delete button. For a long moment, the image glared up at her, its fake happiness mocking her. Then, with a single swipe, the photo was gone. No more ties to the past. The only thing left was the quiet relief of severing yet another thread. Joan sat back, the silence of the room settling in around her. She turned her attention back to the trust documents that lay spread across the table. Her pen was poised, ready to add something more meaningful this time. She flipped to the section she'd been avoiding, her thoughts already made up. She wrote carefully, her signature flowing easily as she made the final decision. A charitable gift to a parenting support fund. It felt right. It wasn't for Tessa or Brent or anyone who had ever tried to make her feel small or insignificant. It was for the families who needed help the way she once had. A gesture of support, a hope for change, for those who were truly trying to build something healthy and strong. She signed it off, feeling the weight of every penny being directed to something better. When the paperwork was finished, Joan picked up her phone, feeling the unfamiliar quiet of the moment wash over her. There was a message from Caitlin, a picture of her smiling widely with the words, "You're the grandma I got lucky with," scrawled in the corner. Joan's chest tightened as she looked at the photo, her eyes stinging for a moment. She quickly typed a response. "No, Caitlin, it's me who's lucky to have you." It was a promise she would keep. She had done everything she could for the generations before her, but now she would do better by Caitlin. There would be no guilt, no regrets, no expectations of things undone. A ping from Naomi pulled her back. She didn't need to look at the message to know what it would say. Naomi had been a constant through all of this, her voice steady, her wisdom unwavering. She'd always known the truth, even when Joan had struggled to see it. They think life means second chances. You've given them enough. Joan smiled bitterly, a chuckle escaping her lips. Naomi always knew how to cut through the noise. Tessa's second chances weren't her responsibility. She wasn't obligated to keep trying. There was a part of Joan that had held on for too long, but Naomi had helped her find the strength to cut it all off. And now, there was only forward. Joan leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply as she opened a new document on her laptop. This was it, the final family statement, the last piece of closure she would ever need to write. I gave everything I had. The silence is the last thing. She paused after typing the words, her fingers resting on the keyboard. It was simple, but it was true. There was no more room for apologies, no more space for explanations. The final chapter had been written. Joan closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of her decision sinking in, then stood and moved toward the canvas she had set up in the corner of the room. The art class was something she had started only a few weeks ago, a small step in reclaiming her life and finding a new outlet for her creativity. The brushstrokes were uneven at first, but with every session, she felt more connected to something that wasn't shaped by the past. She picked up her paintbrush, the canvas awaiting her next move. The world felt brighter as she added another stroke of color to the painting. After a few more minutes, she stepped back, surveying the work. It was rough, unpolished, but it was hers, a glimpse of something beautiful emerging from the mess. Later that evening, she posted the piece for sale online, not expecting much, just a small leap into the world she was slowly building. By morning, there was a message. Someone had bought it for $20. Joan's heart fluttered with something unfamiliar. It wasn't about the money. It was about something she had created, something that belonged to her. The future was hers, and it was beautiful. Joan stood at the window, her hands lightly resting on the sill as she watched the sun dip lower into the horizon, casting a golden glow across the backyard. It was one of those quiet moments where time seemed to stretch out in front of her, waiting for the next step. But she was stuck, not because she was unsure, but because of the weight of what she had yet to do. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter, its white surface too pristine, too unchanged. Joan had seen it every day for the past few weeks. The card she had written, the words she had almost given. A gift that she had once believed would make things right. A birthday card meant for Tessa, a final token of the relationship she thought they could still salvage. A way to smooth things over, but now it felt like a relic of a past that was long gone. A gesture that no longer held any meaning. Joan picked it up, feeling the smooth paper between her fingers, the sharp corners pressing into her palm. She hadn't even sealed it. She hadn't been able to bring herself to write anything beyond the initial greeting. She stared at the card for a long moment, her mind flooded with memories of the time when she had believed it was possible to fix things, to repair what had been broken. She thought she could reach across the gap, find some common ground, restore the illusion of family. But now, with the weight of everything behind her, Joan knew better. She had already given everything she could. Emotions, time, patience. It was gone. The card was the last thread, the last lingering symbol of her old self, the version of her who still believed in second chances for people who didn't deserve them. Joan walked toward the fireplace, her footsteps steady, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened the small grate, placed the card inside, and struck a match. The flame flickered for a moment, then caught. She held it to the corner of the card, watching as the edges curled and turned black. It was a slow burn, the paper disintegrating piece by piece as it disappeared into the fire. She stood there for a moment, entranced by the flames, the crackling heat, until the last shred of the card vanished completely. It was gone. And so was the idea that she owed Tessa anything. Joan turned away from the fireplace, feeling lighter, almost liberated. She walked back to the desk, where the final version of her will sat in front of her, Naomi's careful, confident handwriting beside her own. Naomi had signed it earlier that day, the last of the paperwork complete. Tessa had been removed from the distribution. There would be no more claims, no more expectations from someone who had never truly understood what family meant. Joan ran her fingers over the paper, where she had added the final clause. Caitlin will be added as the sole executor of this estate. The words were simple, but they held a power Joan could feel deep in her bones. Caitlin would be the one to carry the legacy, to decide how everything she had worked for would be used. The past had no place in it. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. A message from Naomi. All done. The trust is as it should be. Joan let out a slow breath, the finality of it settling in her chest. She didn't need Tessa's approval. She didn't need anyone's approval anymore. It was done. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Lauren standing there, her eyes bright with understanding, a smile tugging at her lips. You did it, Lauren said simply, stepping forward and pulling Joan into a tight hug. You did what most never dare. Joan felt the weight of the words, the weight of the hug. She had made the hard decisions, the ones most people wouldn't be able to make. She had chosen herself, and in doing so, she had chosen the future. The silence had become her final act of strength. She pulled back slightly, meeting Lauren's gaze. A soft smile tugged at her lips. It feels right, she said quietly, her voice steady. Lauren stepped back, watching her with a knowing look. You finally let it all go. Joan nodded, her eyes drifting to the fireplace, where the smoke was rising in gentle swirls, twisting into the night air. The past was gone, burned away, and in its place was something new, something that belonged only to her. She looked out the window, the sky now turning from gold to deep violet. The world was quiet, waiting. The future was open, and for the first time in years, Joan felt ready to embrace it. As the smoke curled higher, Joan smiled, peaceful, unburdened. Joan sat at the desk, the final versions of her public documents spread out before her, the weight of them settling like a mantle across her shoulders. It was a strange feeling, closure, liberation, and anticipation, all tangled up into one tight knot. The decisions had been made. There was no more back and forth, no more second-guessing. The past had been sorted, filed, burned, and archived. It was time to move forward. Her fingers traced the inked signatures, each one marking the end of a chapter and the beginning of something far more authentic. She flipped through the remaining papers, adjusting a few clauses in the trust to ensure it was all accounted for. Every asset now retitled under the Legacy Trust, every home, every investment, every tangible piece of her life, redefined and protected, locked away for the future. She could feel the past lifting from her, no longer burdened by people who thought they had claim to her life. The last form was signed and placed in the binder. She leaned back, her fingers still tingling from the motion. She had done everything she could. Now it was time to let go of even the smallest bit of worry. Joan stood up, the soft click of her chair moving across the hardwood floor, cutting through the silence of the room. She moved toward the corner, where a small stack of blank notebooks sat waiting. She had been meaning to start this project for months, but it had always seemed too daunting, too emotionally heavy, but not anymore. She picked up the first notebook and opened it, the crisp pages waiting to be filled. She began to write, a loose outline taking shape as the words flowed easily from her fingertips. It wasn't about perfection or telling every detail. It was about telling her story, the one she had finally come to terms with, the messy, painful truth of it, but also the strength, the resilience, and the lessons learned. Lauren had suggested this, of course. She had been there through the years of silent upheaval, helping Joan navigate the impossible. Now she was offering something more, helping Joan shape her words into something others could understand, something that might help others who found themselves in the same emotional labyrinth Joan had once been trapped in. She paused, lifting her phone to text Lauren. I'm starting. Let's do this together. A minute later, Lauren's reply came through. You've got this, Joan. I'll be right there. Joan smiled softly, the first genuine smile in a while. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She had allies, real people who had earned her time, her trust, and her stories. She went back to the memoir, laying the notebook on the desk, and began drafting the outline. For you to finish someday. The words felt powerful, final, and inevitable. Caitlin would be the one to carry the next part of the story, the next chapter. She would finish it someday, when the time was right. Joan placed the outline in a file and closed it, making sure it was marked with her initials. It was a gift she would give, but only when Caitlin was ready. She wasn't pushing. This was for her granddaughter to carry on her own time, her own terms. The quiet hum of the house enveloped Joan as she sat down to look at her calendar. She had planned this trip for years, Santa Fe. She'd always dreamed of seeing it, of experiencing it in the raw, the untouched beauty of the desert, landscapes, and the vibrant art scene. It had always seemed so far away, something for a future she couldn't quite reach. But now, everything felt different. Joan clicked over to the flight booking site. It was a small thing, a personal indulgence, but it meant so much. She tapped in her details, her heart quickening slightly with the excitement of the new adventure. With one final click, the ticket was booked. Santa Fe was no longer a dream, it was a destination. As she confirmed the booking, her thoughts drifted back to Tessa. Joan hadn't opened her text in weeks, but it was still there, sitting in her inbox, waiting for her. The message that had started everything, the one full of guilt, of false hope, of manipulation. Joan hadn't deleted it, hadn't responded. Instead, she had saved it, archived it, as a reminder of why things had gone wrong. She opened it now, staring at the message that had once caused so much turmoil. "I'm sorry, I miss you. Can we fix this?" Joan let out a slow breath as she read it again, the words heavy in their meaning, but without the sting they once carried. It was a simple message, yet it had held so much power over her for so long. She closed the text without responding. She didn't need to. The message was saved. A piece of the past she no longer needed to revisit. The chapter was finished. Joan sat back, the room feeling lighter than it ever had. She was free. She had done what she needed to do, what she should have done long ago. The past was archived. The future was waiting. The fire in her chest, a fire she hadn't realized she'd been holding back, had finally burned out, leaving only quiet strength in its place. She looked at the wall ahead of her, the soft glow of the sunset slipping into the room, and smiled. The future was hers. Joan wandered through the Santa Fe market, the cobblestone streets beneath her feet feeling warm from the afternoon sun. The air smelled faintly of roasting peppers and spices, mingling with the earthy scent of the desert. Everywhere she looked, colors danced, bright scarves hanging from stalls, vibrant pottery stacked in neat rows, silver jewelry catching the sunlight. The lively hum of voices surrounded her, but for the first time in years, Joan felt unburdened. A quiet sense of joy fluttering inside her chest. She had made it. Here, to this place she had dreamed of for so long. There was no looking back now. This wasn't just a trip. This was a declaration of freedom, of release. She stopped in front of a small stall filled with handcrafted wooden toys, delicate figures of animals, tiny hand-painted trinkets, and a music box that caught her eye. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each detail made with care, the soft glow of the wood contrasting against the bright hot pink of the desert flowers nearby. Joan's heart gave a small, inexplicable leap. She picked it up, a tiny, intricately carved music box with a dancer inside, spinning slowly when the lid was lifted. It was perfect. She thought of Caitlin, of the future she was building for her. Caitlin would appreciate this, Joan thought. She wasn't just leaving her a legacy in terms of wealth or possessions. No, she was giving her the things that mattered. The lessons, the moments, the simple joys. Joan could imagine Caitlin sitting with the music box on her lap, her fingers lightly tracing the carvings, hearing the soft lull of the music in the background. A new tradition, a new memory to build. She smiled as she paid the vendor, slipping the box into a small velvet pouch, feeling the warmth of the gesture settle in her palms. Joan continued her walk, meandering through the bustling market, but something stopped her. A bench, tucked away beneath the shade of a sprawling tree, beckoned her. She sat down, the cool wood smooth against her skin, and leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. The sound of people passing, laughter, chatter, the distant strum of a guitar, felt like a melody, a rhythm she hadn't realized she was missing. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Her phone buzzed, the sudden intrusion pulling her from the peaceful moment. Joan reached for it, glancing at the screen, her pulse quickening when she saw the name, Tessa. Joan's thumb hovered over the screen, her mind already made up. She had no reason to open the message, no reason to let the past back in. She turned the phone off without a second thought, sliding it into her bag, and exhaled slowly. There was nothing left to say, no more energy to waste. The world seemed to breathe with her as she sat there, the sun lowering in the sky, casting long shadows on the street. Her body felt light, free in a way that only comes after letting go of something too heavy. As the evening descended, Joan walked back to her hotel room, the music box tucked gently in her bag. She sat at the small desk, a soft lamp illuminating the room in warm, golden light. Joan opened her journal, the pages crisp beneath her fingertips, and she wrote one final entry in her trust notes. It felt like the last thing she needed to do. Her final words, sealed and secure for the future. Peace is not owed, it is chosen. The words seemed to fill the room, their weight settling over her like a blanket, warm and comforting. She closed the journal with a sense of finality, feeling the quiet peace of the moment settle into her bones. Later that evening, she sent the final documents to Naomi. It was done. The legacy trust had been finalized. Caitlin was now the sole executor. She was the one who would carry this forward, the one who would make sure that everything Joan had worked for would be passed on with integrity and care. Joan's fingers lingered over the final line of her family statement, one she had written long ago but never shared. She had always known it would be her last word on the matter. My daughter told me to get lost, so I gave her a gift she'll regret forever. Her smirk tugged at Joan's lips as she reread it, the words fitting her perfectly. She wasn't just leaving Tessa behind. She was leaving her with something far more potent than any inheritance, the gift of finality, of boundaries. Joan tucked the statement into her bag, the weight of it surprisingly light. She stood up from the desk and walked over to the window, looking out at the Santa Fe night sky, clear and vast, filled with a million stars. The world felt expansive, like anything was possible. A soft knock on the door broke the stillness, and Joan turned toward it, the smile already forming on her lips. The future was finally hers.